Okay, so you want to own a supermarket. Thousands of customers rolling carts through your aisles every single week, a product nobody can ever stop buying, and revenue that looks, on paper, like one of the safest business models on earth. You picture a cash machine humming quietly in the background, food flying off the shelves in a business that never truly slows down. Sounds simple. It is not simple. Here is what nobody tells you before you sign the lease on that 42,000 square foot building. The average American supermarket brings in roughly $712,000 a week, which works out to nearly $37 million a year in gross sales, and yet the owner of that store walks away with less than $2 out of every 100 a customer spends at the register. This is not really a retail business at all. It is a logistics operation wearing a retail costume, and understanding that single fact changes everything about how you should think about owning one. Let us start with the number that should stop most first-time buyers cold. Building a genuine, full-scale independent supermarket costs somewhere between $3.5 million and $16 million, depending heavily on location, and the average supermarket footprint runs around 42,000 square feet, roughly the size of a small city block under one roof. Refrigeration alone, the walk-in coolers and the open-air display cases lining every aisle, typically costs between $250,000 and $750,000, and that number is not padded, because a single 20-foot by 20-foot commercial walk-in cooler can run past $25,000 entirely on its own, before you have installed a single display case for milk, meat, or produce. Initial inventory adds another $200,000 to $500,000 just to fill the shelves before opening day. And even something as mundane as shopping carts, the small metal fleet every customer takes for granted, can run $15,000 to $40,000 total depending on how many you need. None of this touches the invisible engineering underneath the building itself, the loading docks and refrigerated truck bays that keep perishable inventory moving in and out on a strict schedule, the specialized electrical infrastructure required to run dozens of refrigeration units simultaneously without ever losing power to a single one, and the drainage and ventilation systems built specifically around a bakery, a deli, and a seafood counter all operating under one roof. By the time the doors open, you have spent millions of dollars on infrastructure a customer will never consciously notice, because none of it is designed to be seen. It is designed to keep food cold, fresh, and moving. There is also a decision baked into every square foot of that 42,000 square foot floor plan that most first-time owners never fully appreciate: the fixture and shelving system itself. Commercial-grade shelving, refrigerated display cases for the perimeter departments, specialized bakery ovens, deli slicing equipment, and point-of-sale systems tied into inventory management software together add several $100,000 more on top of the core build-out, and every single one of those fixtures has to be replaced on a recurring capital cycle. Refrigerated cases every 8 to 12 years, flooring and shelving on a similar horizon, which means the initial build-out figure is really just the entry price into a business that will keep demanding significant reinvestment every single decade just to stay competitive with a newly built store opening down the street. So the shelves are stocked, the registers are humming, and now the daily grind of keeping this operation alive begins, because a supermarket carries one of the most punishing fixed-cost structures of any retail format on this channel, layered directly on top of margins that were already razor-thin before a single expense was even counted. This is operating leverage applied to perishable inventory. Refrigeration runs 24 hours a day, every single day, because a single extended power failure does not simply cost you a slow afternoon. It can wipe out tens of thousands of dollars in meat, dairy, and produce inventory within hours. Payroll ticks constantly across a workforce that has to staff registers, stock shelves, run the deli counter, and restock refrigerated cases continuously throughout every operating hour, regardless of whether the store is packed with a Saturday morning rush or nearly empty on a slow Tuesday evening. And then there is the cost that never shows up cleanly on any single invoice: shrinkage. Total shrinkage across the grocery sector averages between 1.6% and 3% of sales. And employee theft alone accounts for roughly 42% of all shrink losses, with shoplifting adding another 37% on top of that. Spoilage compounds this further and independently because fresh produce alone loses an average of 11.6% of stock to spoilage before it ever reaches a customer's cart. And across the entire country, supermarkets throw away an estimated $15 billion worth of unsold fruits and vegetables every single year. Here is why that number matters so much more in this business than in almost any other retail format. Because on margins this thin, a single $100 inventory loss requires the store to generate over $5,000 in brand new sales just to break even on that one mistake. None of these costs pause during a slow week. The coolers still run, the payroll still clears, and the produce still spoils on its own schedule, whether the store had a record sales day or a disappointingly quiet one. Energy costs deserve special attention in this particular business, because unlike almost any other retail format, a supermarket is essentially operating dozens of individual refrigeration systems simultaneously around the clock, from walk-in coolers to open-air dairy cases to frozen food units, each one drawing power continuously regardless of store traffic. That electricity bill does not simply scale down during a slow season the way staffing hours might, because the temperature requirements protecting perishable inventory remain exactly the same whether the store is packed or empty, which makes utility costs one of the purest examples of a fixed cost. This entire channel has covered a bill that arrives in full every single month with almost zero ability to meaningfully reduce it without directly risking the inventory it exists to protect. So how does anyone actually turn a real profit running a business this exposed on both margin and shrinkage at once? This is the popcorn business moment, and in a supermarket it is built directly into the physical geography of the store itself. The center aisles, the long rows of canned goods, cereal, and packaged national brands that most customers picture when they think of a grocery store are essentially loss leaders, carrying gross margins around only 26%. The real profit lives on the perimeter of the building, in the departments most customers barely think about as the profit engine at all. The deli and prepared foods counter runs gross margins of 40 to over 50%, and the in-store bakery is often the single most profitable department in the entire building, routinely exceeding 55% gross margin. Floral, despite occupying barely more than 1% of the store's total footprint, generates gross margin around 46%, an almost absurd return on such a tiny sliver of retail real estate. Layered on top of that perimeter strategy sits a second profit engine: private label. National brand products leave the retailer with only about 26% gross margin, because a meaningful chunk of that shelf price is funding the manufacturer's own marketing budget rather than the store's bottom line. A store's own private label version of that identical product flips that equation entirely, cutting out the manufacturer's marketing spend and letting the retailer walk away with a gross margin closer to 35% on the exact same shelf space. The sweet spot most sophisticated operators target is having private label make up somewhere between 35 and 40% of total products sold, because that mix maximizes margin without alienating customers who still want recognizable national brands available. And underneath both of these strategies sits a third, quieter revenue stream almost invisible to shoppers: slotting fees. The payments manufacturers make directly to the store just to secure premium shelf placement, running several hundred to over $1,000 per item per store, because eye level is buy level, and that principle alone generates real income before a single unit of that product has even sold. Store layout itself functions as a fourth, almost invisible profit lever, engineered with genuine psychological precision. Roughly 9 out of 10 shoppers naturally drift to the right when they enter a store, which is exactly why most supermarkets are laid out to guide foot traffic in a deliberate counterclockwise loop, since data consistently shows counterclockwise shoppers spend a couple of dollars more per visit than customers navigating a store laid out the opposite way. Even shelf height becomes a calculated business decision rather than simple organizational convenience, with lower shelves strategically loaded with sugary, high-margin products angled directly toward the eye line of a small child sitting in the cart. A detail that sounds almost cynical stated plainly, but reflects just how thoroughly every square inch of a supermarket floor plan has been optimized to extract incremental margin from a customer who walked in only planning to buy milk and bread. Now here is the trap door under the floor, and it is not a single dramatic event. It is the mathematical fragility baked directly into an industry-wide net profit margin sitting somewhere between 1 and 3%, with food retailers averaging just 1.7% in the most recent full year of data. Run that percentage against $37 million in annual revenue, and a store keeps roughly $629,000 a year, a number that sounds substantial in isolation but represents almost no cushion whatsoever against unexpected cost pressure. A modest spike in supplier prices, a wage increase across a unionized workforce, or a stretch of unusually heavy shrinkage can each individually erase a meaningful share of that entire year's profit, because there is simply no fat left in the model to absorb the shock once you understand how thin that margin already runs before anything goes wrong. This structural fragility is exactly why the grocery industry has proven so uniquely vulnerable to a single factor no individual store owner actually controls: debt-financed competition and rising labor costs arriving simultaneously. A supermarket chain financed with meaningful leverage against its real estate and distribution infrastructure has almost no room to absorb a bad year, because a business already keeping less than $2 out of every 100 in revenue cannot simply cut costs its way out of a debt service obligation the way a higher margin business might. Layer in labor negotiations across a heavily unionized workforce, and rising wage costs alone can push an already thin margin into outright unprofitability faster than almost any comparable retail format, since payroll represents one of the largest controllable costs in a business, where nearly every other line item is already stretched to its structural limit. There is a third dimension to this trap worth naming directly: competitive price transparency. Because grocery pricing is compared constantly and publicly through weekly circulars, loyalty app pricing, and increasingly through instant online comparison, a supermarket has almost no ability to quietly absorb rising costs into its shelf prices the way a business with more differentiated products might. Raise center aisle prices even modestly above a nearby discount competitor, and price-sensitive customers notice immediately and simply shop elsewhere for those exact items, which locks an already thin margin business into a pricing structure it can barely influence, even as its own input costs continue to rise independently of what any competitor down the street happens to be charging. Let us talk about the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, better known simply as A&P, a company that for decades was the largest retailer of any kind in the United States and pioneered the entire self-service supermarket format that every grocery store on earth still uses today. Founded in 1859, A&P grew to an almost unimaginable scale, operating as many as 16,000 stores at its peak in the 1930s and dominating American food retail from the 1920s through the 1960s. But the same operational playbook that built that empire, aggressive scale, thin margins run at massive volume, and heavy reliance on real estate and distribution infrastructure, made the company nearly impossible to adapt once the competitive ground shifted underneath it in later decades. By the 2000s, A&P had loaded itself with substantial debt, including a costly $1,300 million acquisition of competitor Pathmark in 2007, right as discount retailers like Walmart and Target aggressively expanded into the grocery business and undercut A&P's pricing on the exact commodity center aisle products that were never high margin to begin with. On December 12, 2010, A&P filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, listing over $2.5 billion in assets against $3.2 billion in debt, after bleeding cash at a rate of nearly $5 million a week in the months leading up to the filing. The company emerged from that first bankruptcy in 2012 as a private company backed by Ron Burkle's Yucaipa Companies, with $490 million in fresh debt and equity financing, and union workers agreeing to $600 million in cost concessions just to keep the business alive. It was not enough. Less than 5 years later, on July 19, 2015, A&P filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy for a second time, citing high labor costs, falling sales, and months of heavy losses, and this time there would be no third act. The company immediately closed 25 of its remaining 300 stores and pursued a court-led auction for everything else, laying off more than 26,000 workers in the process. By November 2015, a company with a 156-year history and 28,500 remaining employees simply ceased to exist. The lesson is not that scale itself is dangerous. The lesson is that a business already operating on razor-thin margins has almost no structural room to absorb heavy debt, rising labor costs, and aggressive discount competition arriving at the same time. And once that combination takes hold, even the company that literally invented the modern supermarket format has no real path back. The final chapter of A&P's story adds one more layer worth noting, because when the company filed its second and final bankruptcy in 2015, roughly 93% of its workforce was represented by one of 12 different labor unions, many carrying bumping rights and seniority protections that management itself described as a significant barrier to the kind of rapid cost restructuring the business desperately needed. This detail matters not as commentary on organized labor itself, but as an illustration of exactly how little flexibility a business running on a 1 to 3% margin actually has. Because even a company staring directly at liquidation found itself structurally unable to move quickly enough on its single largest controllable cost to save itself in time. Let us run the numbers on a typical independent supermarket generating that industry average $37 million in annual gross sales. Optimistic scenario against realistic bad year. In the optimistic scenario, your private label penetration sits in that healthy 35 to 40% range. Your perimeter departments, deli, bakery, and floral are running at or above their target margins, and your shrinkage stays disciplined near the low end of the 1.6 to 3% industry range. On that revenue base, a well-run store can hold net profit margin near the stronger end of the industry's 1 to 3% range, generating somewhere around $750,000 to over $1 million in annual net profit, supporting a payback period in the roughly 5 to 10 year range on a mid-size build-out investment. Now, the realistic bad year. Supplier costs rise industry-wide due to broader inflationary pressure, and because your center aisle products already carry only 26% gross margin, you have almost no room to pass those increases fully onto price-sensitive customers without losing them to a discount competitor down the street. Shrinkage creeps toward the upper end of the range as theft and spoilage both tick upward simultaneously, and because every $100 in inventory loss on these margins requires over $5,000 in new sales just to offset, even a modest increase in shrinkage rate can erase a meaningful share of your annual profit outright. Payroll costs rise as well, whether through minimum wage increases or union contract negotiations. And your fixed costs, the refrigeration running continuously, the lease payment, the equipment financing on your walk-in coolers, do not move by a single dollar in response to any of this. Net profit margin can compress from that already thin 1 to 3% range down toward break-even or an outright loss, precisely the trajectory that pushed A&P toward its second and final bankruptcy filing. The difference between these two scenarios on a single $37 million revenue store can easily exceed several $100,000 in a single year, and for an owner carrying meaningful debt against the original build-out, that swing is exactly the kind of gap that turns a comfortable debt service coverage ratio into a genuine solvency crisis almost overnight. So what is a supermarket? Once you strip away the produce displays and the endless rows of packaged goods, it is a machine that turns massive transaction volume into survivable profit only by hiding its real margin structure in plain sight. On the perimeter of the building rather than in the center aisles, most customers assume are the actual business. The milk, the bread, the canned goods everyone walks in expecting to buy are barely profitable at all, functioning as the traffic-generating excuse to get a customer through the door and past the bakery, the deli, and the floral counter that actually fund the operation. You are not really buying a building full of groceries. You are buying an extraordinarily precise logistics operation, running on margins so thin that a single bad month of shrinkage, spoilage, or supplier price increases can erase what took an entire year of near-flawless execution to build, in a business where even the company that invented the modern supermarket eventually ran out of room to absorb the next mistake.